Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here for the third episode of Adoption and Astrology. I am Jenna. I am an adult adoptee and an evolutionary astrologer. If you haven't been here before, please take a moment to like and subscribe so that you can be in the know whenever there is a new episode launching, and we can stay in community together. So today we're going to be talking about adoptee consciousness, Chiron, and Trans-Neptunian objects. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is let's get on the same page about the Adoptee Consciousness Model, because this is an academic model that was developed in 2022 originally by 5 researchers: Chiron Kim, Susan Bronco, Grace Newton, Paula O'Loughlin, and Stephanie Koopa Luter. And these 5 adoptees of color created this consciousness model in order to help facilitate more understanding around the layers and the nuance of consciousness that adoptees move through as we process and journey through adoption consciousness. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen and showing you their graphic of the Adoptee Consciousness Model. Right? Hopefully you can see that. Now you definitely can see that. So the Adoptee Consciousness Model, you can see it right here. It's this circle. And what we're talking about is a spiral is how it was presented. A spiral where touchstones or certain turning points end up propelling adoptees into a different aspect of their consciousness. This isn't a linear set of stages. These are touchstones that adoptees can move through, jumping from place to place, moving seemingly in forward directions or backward direction. That's why it's a circle. There actually is no forward or backward direction. We can move through all 5 stages at different points in our life, even if we've been to all of the stages before. There's an emphasis in their work around respecting people at all stages of consciousness. And that's actually very important. And that is a through line into the work of astrologers, because we need to respect our clients where they're at as well and present them with information in a way that's going to be digestible for the client, and also in a way that's going to respect their agency, respect their sovereignty, and, make sure that we're treating our clients in a way that they can receive the information and not feel judged, not feel like they're being projected on either. So the first stage that we're going to talk about is status quo, right there at the top. And those in status quo are people who, generally, this is where we start. These are adoptees who are really committed to the dominant narrative of adoption, saying that this is a positive thing, or only looking at positive perspectives or asset-based perspectives about adoption, which basically points to like, oh, it's so nice that you were adopted because you have all of these opportunities or all of these resources, et cetera, et cetera. That's what asset-based means. People who are in status quo, adoptees who are in status quo, tend to get easily either defensive or even offended when adoption isn't framed in this positive way. There's also a tendency to strive to be kind of the model adoptee, is what we say, like an adoptee who behaves well and achieves and doesn't complain and kind of moves through life as like the good adoptee. The next stage as we go around clockwise is rupture. And a rupture is generally an event that occurs when an adoptee encounters either information or an experience or some sort of incident that disrupts that status quo narrative. It causes the adoptee to rethink what they know. It can also cause them to question their entire identity. So examples of this would be like discovering that your adoption information is not accurate, whether it means that you came into your family through different avenues than were originally presented. Perhaps you find out that the agency or the attorneys were, working either unethically or using false information. A lot of adoptees also find out that they actually could describe their adoptions as what we say gray market adoptions, where it's like nothing fully illegal happened, but this wasn't completely above board. And then all the way into finding out that there was actually illegal action taken, such as trafficking or kidnapping. There's also rupture can occur when adoptees don't know that they were adopted, and then they find out. So we say with adoption that the child ideally has no memory of being told that they were adopted, because it was always part of their narrative. It was always something that they knew about themselves. So learning that their family had kept their adoption a secret, or even later in life, late discovery adoptees who find out as teens or into adulthood, that can be a huge rupture for adoptees that causes them to really question that status quo narrative. The next stage in the circle, we see dissonance. And dissonance describes this tension or like a contradiction between wanting to acknowledge some of the complexities or the things that we're finding out about adoption, but also not wanting to be seen as ungrateful or angry. It's like you're being torn between these multiple identities and struggling to see kind of the both and of adoption. It doesn't always have to be either or. Like we can say, I really don't like the practice of adoption, but I really do like my adoptive family. We can hold those together. That can be difficult when we're in dissonance, to recognize that we can hold those at the same time. It could also look like suppressing some sort of emergent understanding around the complexities of adoption out of a sense of not wanting to be seen as grateful or ungrateful or angry. Also, we could talk about adoptees who kind of feel this yearning to be in community with other adoptees, but also feel really uncomfortable or afraid of that because they're not really sure how to talk about adoption. They haven't really had that opportunity. So there's like this push-pull between some intrinsic need or desire or curiosity, while also having this kind of like door shutting instinct on the other side of that. The next step we see is expansiveness. And an important aspect of expansiveness is that we're learning to sit in that paradox that dissonance was feeling uncomfortable with. We're learning to accept and understand that there are multiple perspectives on adoption, and perhaps multiple ways that we can tell our story. Expansiveness tends to be a time of deep reflection. It can also be a time of reinventing ourselves or reincorporating the different things that happened in our lives, learning to own our stories in different ways, as well as, practicing being our authentic selves, getting really curious about that and in touch with it. It tends to also be a time of personal growth as well as community growth, getting into community with other adoptees or other people who have had similar experiences, similar processes. Participating in some level of community that has a creative, expressive component. A lot of adoptees use art or music or writing or even social media to express themselves and get their story out there. That can be a part of expansiveness. Adoptees may also start to explore their racial or ethnic culture, and that is an expansiveness stage too, whether that's through travel or learning their native language or seeking community spaces that are centered around their ethnic or racial backgrounds. That's a big part of expansiveness, especially for the BIPOC and transracial and transnational adoptee community. I am a white domestic adoptee, so I'm not speaking from experience on that, but I am speaking from what was presented by these authors at a recent updated talk on the Adoptee Consciousness Model, as well as my peers in adoptee professionals who have spoken on this. And the final stage in this circle, moving around, it's not really the final stage, it's just the final one that I'm talking about, because we can move, like I said before, between all of these different stages. But agency. And agency was previously referred to as forgiveness and activism, but based on community feedback, the authors kind of adjusted this to be the agency step. And agency describes the ways that adoptees promote empowerment for themselves as well as for other adoptees. So an adoptee shifting away from focusing on like the personal impacts of adoption on their life and starting to have a sense of responsibility for the larger community. We see this a lot with community leaders in adoption, people who start organizations or start looking into becoming a researcher or take on, all sorts of activism paths. So adoptees may focus on challenging systemic oppression in adoption practices or bringing light to the history of adoption, the truth around adoption. An adoptee may focus on challenging the dominant narrative and kind of saying like, yo, status quo, some of those dominant narratives that we're kind of force feeding to our society are actually really dangerous. So let's try to shift away from that rainbows and unicorns narrative, as Ostrich calls it from Adoption Mosaic. An adoptee may commit to doing this type of advocacy or activism for adoptees or for first families or for populations that are harmed by adoption. It's not always just centered around adoption or adoptee advocacy. So, and even within that, we can see agency happening on a larger, more public scale or a more public stage, or it can be a more of an internal experience for an adoptee, especially if part of that agency revolves around the process of forgiveness. And we're talking about not necessarily just forgiveness for the external factors, but also internally, forgiving ourselves for what we didn't know, and also forgiving ourselves for the decisions that we made, and recognizing with compassion that everyone was doing the best that they can, including little us, little adoptee us, and maybe the things that we weren't processing, or the feelings we weren't voicing, or the things we weren't able to express back then, showing ourselves softness around that and forgiveness around that. Because ultimately, we recognize in moving through adoptee consciousness that this system was really set up to harm and conceal the truth. And when we start to recognize that, we're all parts of the adoption constellation, be it first parents, birth parents, adoptive families, extended adoptive families, our chosen families, all of these people were part of a system that they didn't potentially realize was set up to conceal the truth, that was set up to essentially only support the formation of the adoptive family rather than support the adoptive family over time as the adoptee grows and ages and relationships morph and we move through that. So you can see kind of even just in this explanation of the adoptee consciousness model that someone might be at one stage of it, and then perhaps a rupture comes up in their life. Like big ruptures can be, when a parent passes away, an adoptive parent or a biological parent. That can be a huge rupture, and that can kind of send this jolt to someone who might have been in an expansive stage or even a agency at that point, and kind of shoot them back into a different phase, just like rupture disrupts the status quo as well. So you can kind of see how we flow through everything. And now where I want to fold astrology in is that I have found, first through my own self-work, but also through my work with clients, that astrology can be a very powerful lens, a very powerful tool for adoptees who are looking to heal some of these early wounds, these early traumas, just learning to understand relationship with self, relationship with their parents, either set of parents, relationships with siblings, whether they're adoptive siblings, biological siblings, siblings that they grew up with or not, relationships with partners. Astrology really holds so much wisdom. And what I want to say is that while we can very much see adoption in a chart of a client, the chart doesn't say from the jump, this child will be relinquished, but rather the chart presents information about how an individual will move through the experience of relinquishment, how that will impact them, and what narratives will be internalized. What lens will the individual have on these experiences? I'm going to go ahead and take that off the stage because we're not talking about that anymore. But this isn't a stagnant lens either when we're talking about the lens of the astrology chart. There's no stagnant view of things like, oh, yes, I see that you are going to struggle with XYZ in your life. No astrologist is really going to say that or in such simplified terms, because there's always room for growth. There's room for the evolving self. We move between expressions of the archetypes of all of the planets and all of the signs and all of the houses throughout our life. The nuances of specific experience could perhaps be unveiled even further through the incorporation of, and we'll get to this in a little bit, trans-Neptunian objects, because these are literally seen as objects of consciousness. So as we're exploring consciousness around relinquishment trauma, early childhood events, and we start looking into that wounding and we start looking deeper and deeper, these trans-Neptunian objects are actually opening up this accelerated and previously not as obtainable, it seems, by humanity, level of healing, understanding, and holding of paradox. And the gift of being here in the universe and on Earth at this specific time, in this specific incarnation, is that we have these expanded levels of consciousness opening up to us at this time. And I think that when people hear that, there's something in us that kind of already is acknowledging like, wow, that actually is true, because it does seem like, as much as there's always been good news and bad news on the grand stage of life, some really shadowy stuff is coming to the surface at this time over the past few years, over the past decade, we can even say. And trans-Neptunian objects, a lot of them were discovered in the early 2000s, 2004 to 2005, but primarily the 90s through the 2010s, early 2010s. And that the discovery of these objects of higher consciousness, whenever we discover a planet, it tends to correlate with some sort of step up here on Earth. As they say, as above, so below. For instance, when Uranus was discovered, the Industrial Revolution was happening, and Uranus is about that ingenuity, invention, making the genius mindset, that very creative, never before seen, future focused level of intellect, that revolutionary perspective. When Pluto was discovered, we're talking 1930, that was around the time when psychology was really getting more highly respected, more mainstream focus on, oh, this isn't just some wackadoodle thing. There's actually something to this. We can actually talk about psychology. We can talk about the mind. We can talk about mental illness. Like, let's lean into this. Of course, it was very messy. This was the beginning of it, of psychology, psychotherapy being taken to the levels that now we see it today. And there's hardly any shame, especially, well, in our culture at least, around, oh, I have a therapist, or, oh, I've been seeing a therapist, or, oh, I really want to get an evaluation. I want to get a neuropsych evaluation. I'm seeing a psychiatrist to work through this problem. We have, as a society, moved to understand, acknowledge, and accept this part of ourselves that prior to the discovery of Pluto, which is a very psychological planet, that wasn't as pronounced in our society. It wasn't right at the forefront. So with that being said, we're going to move into Chiron now. Chiron, the layers of consciousness. For me, when I look at a chart, Chiron is really what opens the gate to that level, those higher levels of consciousness. And then the trans-Neptunian objects I found add these details and depth and nuance that we might not have been able to see otherwise. So let's talk about Chiron. And if you are unfamiliar with the myth of Chiron, stay put, because I'm about to tell you it. So Chiron was the son of Philyra, who was a nymph, human-ish nymph, and she found herself in a situation with Kronos, who was already married, and this was a non-consensual sexual experience that she was in. And when Kronos's wife caught them together, Kronos magically transformed himself, he's a god, into a horse and continued with what he was doing to poor Philyra. And Chiron was the child that resulted from that sexual assault. And when Chiron was born, his mother labored at the caves at the bottom of Mount Pelion in Thessaly, Greece. And when Chiron was born, it was a very difficult labor, and his mother was completely aghast when he was born because he came out half human and the bottom half of him was horse, because his father was a horse when he was made. So his mother was horrified and actually abandoned him in the cave. Chiron was found and taken in by Apollo, one of the gods of the sun, and Apollo was the one that raised him. So already, if you're at all familiar with what adoption is, we're seeing some parallels in these narratives. We're hearing, oh wow, Chiron actually deeply understands what relinquishment trauma is. And it's very interesting to me to think about the consciousness around Chiron's story, and the fact that there are so many adoptees who don't know our origin stories. And one of the things that can be a barrier to search for biological family is the worry that maybe some of our stories, our origins, our beginnings are similar to Chiron's. And perhaps that's going to be very hard for us to hear. And also perhaps it's going to be very hard for our biological parents, our biological mothers, to, if that was their story as well, it might be very triggering for them to meet us. I had a dear friend who I respect a lot, an adoptee professional, share recently that that's something he was very nervous about in meeting his mother, that he would look too much like his birth father. And if it wasn't a union of love, that would be very hard for her. And the compassion that this adoptee had to hold for not only himself, but for the other people in that situation, you can really feel how heavy that can be. But when we're talking about that heaviness, that shadowiness, that's those psychological the wrestling that we do psychologically when deciding, is part of my search as an adoptee going to be around reunification with biological relatives or not? These are kind of the additional things that can come up for us. And it's not often at the forefront of our mind. But here we go. So back to Chiron. So Chiron's taken in by Apollo. Apollo, very good teacher. Anything that he tried to teach Chiron immediately was great at it and tried really hard and succeeded at everything. He was very wise. He was very smart. He was very high achieving. And for the adoptees in the audience, I think you're already hearing some narratives around adoption, because we talk about the compliant adoptee, who is the child who tries to do everything right, in a unconscious or subconscious way of being like, I don't want to get abandoned again, so I'm going to do everything right so that they have no reason to leave me. I don't want that to happen again because that was so painful. That felt so dangerous. That felt so lethal the first time it happened. I have to do everything in my power for that to not happen again. And I'm not saying that this is every adoptee story, and I'm not even saying that this is Chiron's story, because it would be up to Chiron to disclose that to us. Whether you believe that Chiron really existed or not, it would still be up to that individual to say this. Another parallel within Chiron's story too is the fact that when I say he had a human top and then from the waist down he was a horse, oh, that sounds like a centaur. And actually in a lot of books and descriptions they say Chiron was a centaur. But that's a little bit sloppy, because Chiron wasn't really a centaur. He was a mixture of his horse father and his humanoid, human-ish nymph mother. And the centaurs in the myth, the centaurs completely rejected him. They said, you are not really one of us. And I feel like when we say that, and the parallels of the adoptee experience, when adoptees, especially adoptees who are adopted into a culture that isn't their birth culture, or adopted into a race or an ethnic group that isn't their birth race or birth ethnic group, that what can happen is you're told that you're not really one of the crowd. And what can also happen is that when you go back and you find people that do genetically reflect your ethnicity or your race, adoptees can, whether people are saying this or not, adoptees can have this sense of imposter syndrome where it's like, well, I don't really belong because I didn't grow up with this. I don't know the cultural nuances around this. I'm very unfamiliar with these certain intricate details of what's going on here. I'm just unfamiliar with being surrounded by so many people who actually reflect what I see in the mirror. That can be a very tricky situation for adoptees, and not all adoptees. I'm not trying to speak for everybody. But once again, another situation that is very much mirrored in Chiron's myth. As time goes on, Chiron moves through a lot of his traumas and moves through a lot of his wounding and engages in acknowledging what happened to him and trying to find peace, even within the Centaur group. He ends up fighting for the Centaurs in a war and becoming damaged by that. He's shot in the ankle by an arrow, and for the rest of his life he walks with a limp. And that is pretty symbolic of the fact that Chiron wounds, we call Chiron the wounded healer. And we talk about how you have a wound and you heal it and you naturally evolve into a healer of people with similar wounds. But the key thing to remember is that Chiron wounds are never fully healed. That the goal is not full wound care and full restoration back to the beginning or back to point A. Similar to with relinquishment trauma, you're always pretty much going to have some level of impact from what happened from that early childhood trauma. If you're familiar with the leading trauma expert, a great resource for knowledge, for education, for de-shaming, having the audacity to say things like depression and drug addiction are actually a sign that the brain is working well, because what's happening is you're trying to develop a coping skill in a very chaotic situation. This person's name is Gabor Mate. I really admire his work, but he very vulnerably shares his own struggles with trauma and with separation and with abandonment. When he was 18 months old, he was left for 6 weeks during the Holocaust while his mother was trying to secure safety for them. And at 18 months old, he was not cognizant enough, not conscious enough to understand that his mother was coming back. So he experienced that abandonment while she was gone and experienced that trauma. And to this day, he's now probably in his early 80s at this point. When I heard this story, it was told as he was 78 years old. And, we're talking over 7 decades later, he's at the airport waiting for his wife to pick him up. And this is someone who's processed a ton of trauma, obviously. He's a leading expert in trauma. And his wife forgot to pick him up. And he explains that it was like he forgot everything he ever knew, and he was instantly an abandoned child again. And sitting at the airport completely helpless, I have been abandoned, I have been forgotten. And he had to challenge that thinking, and kind of, once he caught on that that's what was going on, that he was not in reality about his situation, but rather he was back at 18 months old, reliving his trauma to some degree while at the airport. He said, wait a minute, I am an adult. I am not abandoned. I am not abandonable. I can pick up the phone. I can call a taxi. I can call a friend. I have other resources. I have other ways to move through this. I do not have to sit back into my trauma. And ultimately, he obviously figured it out and got home from the airport. And I bring that up because that is a perfect example of Chiron wounding, of the fact that this is a wound that needs to be acknowledged, needs to be tended to, needs to be, consciously engaged. But that doesn't mean that this wound ever goes away completely. Things are going to come up from time to time, whether we want to call them triggers, activations, rupture events, however we want to say that, whatever language we want to use. There will be times in our life where these wounds are reactivated, and it's kind of like the universe is saying, have you done enough healing work in this area? Is there more that we can uncover? Is there more to talk about? So we talk a lot about that at the Chiron return, which is around age 51. It's always interesting to me when I see an adoptee, which a Chiron return means Chiron in the sky, 51-year cycle. It goes all the way around and it returns to the place that it was in your natal chart. And it's as if that wound is reactivating, asking you to reflect on how much healing you have done, how much engagement with this wounding we've done in the course of that 51 years, and check in, like, the sensitivities are increased at that moment. That wound is highlighted, and it's kind of like, how are you doing with this? Whenever I meet an adoptee who's around that age or just past that age, sharing a story from around that age, I hear so much of what they're saying and what they're sharing is wrapped up in the archetypes and the symbolism of Chiron. So I'm going to now that we know the myth of Chiron and we see the parallels with adoptees, and we've discussed the Adoptee Consciousness Model, and we can already sort of see how these are layering in together. I wanted to do a little bit of reading from this book, Chiron, Healing Body and Soul. It's by Martin Loss. And the reason I wanted to read from this book is because of all my Chiron books and all my Chiron literature, I feel that a lot of what he says deeply parallels relinquishment trauma, as well as, adoption wounding and the acknowledgement of moving through that, to the point that when I started reading this, I immediately had to put the book down and find out if this guy was an adoptee. And I could not find anything to confirm that he was, but also couldn't find anything to deny that he was. So he'll have to disclose that for himself. But in a way, it's almost more powerful that he isn't seeing this through the lens of being saying what I'm about to read through the lens of being an adoptee, because it is powerful and it is potent. So I actually pulled the quotes out and typed them out, so I won't be reading directly from the book. So he says, Chiron in the natal chart points to the place of our greatest wounds, the things we feel are most missing, wrong, unjust, painful, and or lacking in our lives. It encompasses all the things that we feel consciously or subconsciously should or should not have happened. Okay, doesn't this sound like relinquishment trauma? And could we say that this summarizes that cognitive dance between status quo and rupture? It does for me. All right, next quote. As we approach the wound, so its hidden aspects are illuminated, allowing growth, transformation, healing, and the evolution of consciousness. So that's exactly what we're talking about with the Adoptee Consciousness Model. As we move through rupture and we get to dissonance, we're starting to see the illumination. We're starting to see the nuance, the paradox, the both, and we are approaching that wound. And so everything becomes more illuminated. And within that illumination, that's where we can find the transformation, the healing, and that evolution of consciousness. Are we going to be able to make it through that point and move into the expansiveness? That's really the question. Or are we going to is it going to be really heavy and kind of need us to go into a status quo space, or maybe back into rupture, feeling the jolt of the chaos around rupture? Next quote. Chiron exaggerates Aryan traits and minimizes Libran traits. Thus, Chiron on the surface is going to exaggerate woundedness and minimize healing. And then he goes on to say that healing is a journey of consciousness. Whew. Okay, Chiron exaggerates woundedness. We talk so much in adoption consciousness, in adoption communities. We hold so much space for the woundedness, for the victimization, for the very real, very true stories of how we were harmed in this process. Very unique stories, but all the same, there's a underlying theme of that woundedness, of that victimhood, of that this happened to me. We do talk about healing, but it almost feels like in a lot of spaces, the loudest, most pronounced, which makes sense, the loudest, most pronounced narratives are those of the woundedness, because we're finally able to touch it. We're finally able to say something about it. Even that in and of itself feels so powerful. And ultimately, to do shadow work, the shadow must be acknowledged. And that's what we're doing, is we're acknowledging the shadow. But the trick here is to not get caught in identifying with the shadow. All right, next quote. Psychologically, this means Chiron is far from home, isolated, abandoned, a loner, and so on. This was the exact point in reading the book that I was like, I'm going to go look up if this guy is an adoptee, because this feels too much like that's what he's talking about. Psychologically, Chiron is far from home. Oftentimes, adoptees talk about feeling very alone, very isolated, abandoned, literally a word he used, abandoned, feeling alone, feeling like our story is just on its own little isolated island. Next quote. Well, first of all, I want to talk about agency, because this is going to naturally flow into it. Agency. Chiron's orbit in the sky, 51 years, is mostly confined between Saturn and Uranus. However, sorry, my light just went out. However, there are periods when it is closer to Jupiter or Neptune. Now, that's a quote from Martin's book. And the reason I pulled in agency with this is because when we think about Saturn to Uranus, but then we expand it to include Jupiter and Neptune, Jupiter has this association with the inner child, with this naive worldview. It comes into the solar system before Saturn. It's, everybody, all the little personal planets, and then Jupiter, and then comes Saturn. And Saturn is considered like, I'm responsible, I'm maturing. So to think of Jupiter as pre-Saturn, we're thinking about it as pre-responsibility. We're thinking about the first part of life, that childlike wonder, that time when we're ultimately very innocent and we aren't supposed to be tethered down by the harsh realities of the world. We're supposed to be allowed to dream and think about everything that we wish we could be. Oh, I'm going to be president. I'm going to be an actress. I'm going to be an astronaut. I'm going to be all these things fitted into one lifetime. Don't ever squash a child's dreams just because they're impractical. That's the whole point of that stage of life. Be impractical, dream big, because pretty soon Saturn's going to come around and say, time to put up some actual boundaries around this and decide what actually is the mountain to climb, because you can't do all these things. What truly aligns? What's truly reasonable and practical? Because we have responsibilities now. And then on the other side of Chiron's orbit, which is mostly between Saturn and Uranus, it's elliptical, so it's kind of going in and out. But sometimes it goes past Uranus towards Neptune. And Neptune is associated with unconditional love. It's associated with meaning making, with one consciousness, with an understanding that flows almost effortlessly, but also wordlessly between all beings. Neptune. And when we think about agency and we think about the idea of forgiveness, about the idea of ultimately understanding that everyone has been negatively impacted by this industry, by the fact that there are victims within the adoptee community, but also within the birth parent community, also within the adoptive parent community. There are victims of the institution of adoption far and wide. And, once we start looking at it through this almost Neptunian lens, agency becomes very much the step of the adoptee consciousness model that we slip right into, because we're seeing all of the people impacted. We're able to voice all of the people impacted. We're able to potentially step into activism around it. And we're able to see the different iterations of self that were impacted by adoption. Baby me, childhood me, teenage me, young adult me, maybe the you that became a parent and felt really overwhelmed by things because it was bringing up that trauma of your own relinquishment. Maybe it was around the version of you that showed up when a significant death happened, or there was a significant loss that impacted you as if it was a death. Showing compassion for those sides of ourselves, showing unconditional love for each chapter of our lives. That's a big part of this work. Chiron's disconnectedness with the flow of the solar system, the fact that it oscillates between all of these, is this also perhaps a mirror for the adoptee's disconnectedness with adoptive life? Maybe mirroring the adoptee's disconnectedness with the mainstream narrative from time to time? Does that oscillation between being closest to it was never really closest to Neptune, but closer to Neptune than it is to Saturn, or closer to Uranus than it is to Saturn. Okay, now we're closer to Saturn. Okay, now we're actually edging even closer to the sun than Saturn is, and we're heading towards Jupiter. Is that oscillation maybe mirroring that back and forth between status quo, rupture, dissonance, all of it, agency, expansiveness? There's something around Chiron through and through that very much mirrors the adoptee experience. Chiron is connected to higher consciousness. So does this also mirror some level of the experience of estrangement? Sometimes adoptees talk about, in order to fully know themselves, they had to take space and time away from their entire adoptive family. They had to enter estrangement. It wasn't something that they wanted to necessarily do, but it felt dire. It felt like this was the only way for me to stay tethered to reality, was to kind of divorce myself of these other influences around me, because I was so dependent on them for who I was and what my place in the world was for so long. And now I'm realizing that that wasn't true to who I really am. That wasn't touching my authentic self. And I need to individuate. And the only way for me to individuate is for me to put up some barriers around the people that I'm too porous with. I become too consumed with their narratives, with my relationships, with their frequencies even. This isn't an intentional thing. I'm not even trying to say that it is. But in order to fully access higher consciousness, the disconnectedness must be honored fully as well. We have to find a way to move outside of our current perception, move outside of our current understandings in order to access those higher levels of consciousness. I talked about this a little bit in episode 2 with the courage to search, and how search and reunion are not necessarily even close to the same thing, obviously, but reunion, or a goal of reunion, does not have to be part of search. So I wanted to put that out there, because we can talk about just searching for ourselves, searching for our truth, searching for our story, searching for our ancestry, searching for cultural traditions, searching for recipes that we would have known had we been raised in our birth culture. This is a quote again from this book. When we deny, disown, fail to acknowledge, ignore, try to escape from, condemn, and or try to banish certain parts of ourselves, we are wounded. We are in denial of the larger plan and purpose of the cosmos. Such are the wounds that Chiron mirrors through our natal charts. However, when we walk willingly into our darkness, shining a light, so to speak, we gradually recover the lost pieces of our lives. Such is the healing journey that Chiron also mirrors through our natal charts. Gradually, we become whole once more, reconnected with our higher celestial nature, and take our rightful place as co-creators of this magnificent universe. Most importantly, Chiron's higher message is everything is about perception. Chiron wounds are multidimensional. They are multi-layered. They are multifaceted. Someone's Chiron wound can very much be aligned with relinquishment trauma as an adoptee, or with a wounding around mother, or with an attachment or an abandonment wound. But there can also be other primary presentations of Chiron, or of a Chiron in a chart, that still leave room for relinquishment trauma to be part of the story, while also presenting more directly in other ways. So sometimes people say, like, yeah, I've thought about adoption and I kind of have moved through being an adoptee, and I'm not really interested in entertaining that anymore. And instead of pathologizing that, or saying like, oh, well, then they must just be back in status quo, remember that the authors of the Adoptee Consciousness Model said it is very important for us to respect where everyone is in their stages of consciousness, and not villainize anyone or judge anyone for that. So I don't want us weaponizing the Adoptee Consciousness Model either. That being said, some people, some personalities, some natal charts are more interested in engaging around relinquishment trauma, being an adoptee, than other adoptees are. So when we look at Chiron in any adoptee chart, we can definitely feel into the woundedness around relinquishment. However, there might be other presentations going on, or louder presentations, more engaging presentations of wounding that actually are this person's primary work around their Chiron in this lifetime. When I see clients who have a Chiron that isn't quite as obviously a direct connection to their relinquishment trauma, that can be a signal or a message about the timing of this person's life where they will potentially be processing their trauma and the significance that that moment or moments or big chapter of life will have for them. For whatever reason, this person's psyche wants to process a myriad of other expressions first, or experiences first, perhaps in preparation for that level of consciousness engagement that processing relinquishment trauma is going to bring up for them. But then I'll have other clients where the presentation of Chiron wounding is so wrapped up in mother and the mother wound that it's very clear that this is something that they're going to be engaging with early in their work, whether that means early in life or early in their opening up of their consciousness in other areas. I sometimes see people who barely started to open up their consciousness, and then it almost feels like their flood of adoptee trauma, of relinquishment trauma, kind of comes in and grabs the steering wheel and is saying, this is actually what you're going to be paying attention to now. That can be a very jarring situation, whether this person is 18 years old, whether they're 29 years old, or whether they're 60. Like, this comes up when it comes up, and it can be very jarring. I'll leave it at that. So where we see Chiron, we can definitely get some deep information about our adoptees, ourselves, if we are adoptees with our charts. And when we want to look a little bit deeper, a lot deeper, Trans-Neptunian objects now are what gives us more information about how the wound is integrated into the personality, into the soul's presentation, how wrestling with consciousness is going to be experienced by this individual. And further, what spiritual path of higher consciousness will most serve this client, this individual, this adoptee, in their intentional integration of their shadow work, of their wounding, of their healing. Again, we don't need to pathologize these subtle cues, but rather explore the range of expressions. Shadowy or destructive depths, yes, those as well, but all the way through the higher expressions of that universal oneness that consciousness does bring to us. So let's say November 2019 was, I was in status quo for all intents and purposes. And I had a friend offer to give me an evolutionary astrological reading, astrology reading. And that reading in and of itself was an invitation for rupture in status quo, because the way the astrology was presented by evolutionary astrology, it was so psychological. It was so in depth. It was so embracing of shadow, demystifying it, and not judging the darker arts that we can see in astrology, that I started to think to myself, why does this person, why are they able to say stuff about me that I didn't even know about myself? Like, there's a depth here that I was not aware of within my own identity. That reading was an invitation for rupture to come in. It shook me and kind of consciously, I was consciously engaging rupture at that point by saying, hey, I'm going to keep diving into evolutionary astrology. When we look at Chiron wounds, we talked about this yesterday in Existential Side Quest, about how you never really fully heal the wound, but a lot of times that wound, it's a wound that we're born with, that, you know, as much as it can be summarized in some ways within relinquishment trauma. There is a wound in that area that we're born into, and that is the manifestation of it in this lifetime. Just like I said before, you can't look at a chart and say, oh, this person's going to be relinquished. No, that's just a possible presentation of some of these energies. And once that behavioral experience is set in, that 3D earthbound experience is set in, then we can see how it's going to play out in the chart, because ultimately the chart is a map of our tools, of our gifts, of our soul's intentions in this lifetime, of the highest paths of engagement with growth and actualization. It doesn't say next Tuesday you're going to eat a ham sandwich. It's not behaviorally predictive to that level. It's more spiritually or perhaps emotionally as well. These are some of the challenges that are going to come up for you. Challenges around, so for me, Chiron and Gemini conjunct my moon. So Chiron conjunct mother, a wound conjunct mother moon, a wounding around mother, Gemini, duality, two mothers. It's almost too literal. Am I the only person in the world that has Chiron conjunct moon in Gemini? Absolutely not. Is everyone with Chiron conjunct moon in Gemini a person who has two mothers? Absolutely not. But once that manifestation took place, we're like, that side of the chart, that activation, the energy will find a way to express itself. And look right there, it expressed itself. So then when I start to revisit my Chiron wound, that ancient wound that I was born with, that was reinforced, reactivated, behaviorally expressed through relinquishment trauma and then subsequent adoption, when I start to engage the work of adoptee consciousness and try to move through those stages of the consciousness model into expansion, into agency, activism, forgiveness, essentially what we're doing is we're breaking up scar tissue. We're learning how to move outside of the restrictions that scarring, that scarification was holding in place, that tightening around, like, this is as much as I'm willing to give on this one topic because I am staying safe here. That's essentially what a scar is it's saying, we're keeping this safe. It needs this amount of bundling. But then once the wound is healed and the body can return back to normal and the scar tissue is still there, we want to try, if it's, harming us or preventing us from moving through life, we can go to, massage therapists such as my husband and ask them to break up that work on that scar tissue, break it up, maybe tend to it, put vitamin E ointment on that scar, start to show it that it doesn't need to be this tense. We can show love to this area. We can show love to our woundedness. We can show love to that scar. Try to start breaking up that scar tissue, allowing it to move. Sorry, I have a scar on the back of my neck. That's why I keep going there. Allow it to break up so that the motion can come back into it. The area can learn what safety actually is at this point, now that wounding's over. And what Chiron and its position, its house, its sign, its aspects, such as conjunct moon or squaring something, it's going to touch different things in different people's charts that can give us hints as to how can we break up this proverbial scar tissue? What is it going to look like to learn how to move that part of our body again, expand or stretch or become more flexible in those certain areas, and then potentially tell other people, hey, this worked really great for me. This is how you can break up that scar tissue. It also doesn't need to be that literal of helping to heal other people. It can also just be like living your life, and somebody, for adoptees, somebody seeing another adoptee moving through life, making high achievements, having the things that they wished for themselves, not being defined, held back, or limited by the experience of relinquishment. Trans-Neptunian objects as gates to agency was really where I wanted to go with this last portion here. And we only have about 6 minutes. So I'm going to give a couple examples, because the thing with Trans-Neptunian objects is, like consciousness, a lot of what they deal with is incredibly dark, stories, dark situations, dark archetypes, there's always a higher expression as well. But some of the lower expressions or the more painful presentations of trans-Neptunian objects can feel incredibly heavy. So again, this isn't something that I would necessarily engage with every single client. We want to make sure that we're respecting people where they are in their journey of consciousness. If I have a client who has done a significant amount of psychological work, has an interest in hearing about these higher levels of consciousness, has an available mental toolbox to cope with some of the information that I am going to present them with, then I will move into trans-Neptunian objects. Proceed with caution. That's what I'll say about this. So let's go into Sedna. Let's jump right in. Sedna, named for the Arctic goddess Sedna, because when this planet was discovered, it was literally the coldest planet, trans-Neptunian object, that we knew to date. I think it's something like 240 degrees below Celsius, negative 240 degrees Celsius. I won't get into all that. We only have 4 minutes now. But the story is that Sedna, there's actually a varying legends on this, which is even more interesting because it's almost like the varying stories that adoptees are told about their origins. Oh, your mother loved you so much she gave you up. Then someone else might say, oh, your mom must have been really promiscuous because she had you at a young age. Well, did she love me or was she really promiscuous? Or was she, not a worthy person in society because she relinquished me? Or was she this or was she that? So these varying legends sort of mirrored in Sedna's varying legends. But essentially, Sedna was a woman who was set to be married or was married and either didn't like her husband, he was abusive towards her, she really didn't want to be with him. So she ultimately tried to go back to her family. And what all these myths do have in common is that is the moment of her trying to go back to her family involving her being in the freezing water of the Arctic, her dad being in a boat, and her trying to climb back into the boat in order to reunite with her family. And her father, for whatever reason, he was scared that the boat was going to tip over. He had accepted that this was her fate and that she needed to go to this place. He had signed a contract, whatever. Chopped her fingers off so that she could not climb back into the boat. And she ended up falling off the edge of the boat and drowning. And her fingers becoming sea creatures, her dismembered body falling to the bottom of the ocean, where she became the goddess of the ocean. They don't really have gods in their culture, so we wouldn't call it that. But this higher life form, higher being. This is a lens, Sedna. Sedna is a lens in astrology that is applicable to some clients and in some cases, but not all. It would have to do with, is this Sedna in a aspect presentation that is significant in your chart? And certainly not at any just point in life does Sedna become applicable. There's some stages that this information would be downright harmful to present to a client, even if they did have a very prominent presentation of Sedna. But you can kind of feel it in her story when you meditate on her energy, when you lean into the level of trauma and rejection that she faced. There's like this visceral full body reaction to trauma, visceral reaction to abandonment, severance. My co-host on Monday's show, Kimber, talked about how when she meditated on Sedna, how she started feeling nauseous, like it was almost like out of nowhere. And that's that same feeling that when you have severe abandonment and like you go through some significant loss. I'm sure there's people in the audience that adoptees as well as non-adoptees who have had severances of relationships that literally give you that visceral reaction, that nausea, that, oh my God, I feel sick because of what just happened, because of who I lost, because of this death, of this ending. The metaphor for adoptees even lies within the myth, literally cast away in violence, sinking to the bottom of the sea, and then worshipped. This is part of the story too, is that her fingers turned into these sea creatures that were then hunted for, worshipped by hunters. Sedna was considered a goddess that hunters worshipped because they wanted to find the sea creatures. So adoptees could feel hunted by the adoption industry, kind of worshipped by the people who are trying to make a living off of trafficking. I won't use divisive language, off of the adoption industry, off of taking infants or children from one home, one situation, and moving them to another situation with an exchange, and usually extreme exchange of money in that process. So adoptees can feel very commodified, objectified by this monetizing of human life by the adoption industry. Very Sedna related. There's a part where Alan Clay, in his book on Sedna, which I meant to bring up, but we don't have time anyways, talks about how if we focus too much in the myth about staying in the boat, just like Sedna was trying to stay in the boat, that is us essentially staying in our victimhood. That's the part about Sedna that can be really hard for people to hear. And I see the parallel here. There's a lot of parallels, but staying in the boat for an adoptee as staying in the ghost kingdom. We talk in adoption about the ghost kingdom, which is kind of like the what if land of like, what if I wasn't adopted? Who would I be if I wasn't adopted? Or the ghost kingdom also has all of the people in our life that we feel like our relationships with them were either cut short or somehow prohibited from happening. So the ghost kingdom for young adoptees is a lot of times where their birth family lives. They have these fantasies about who mom was or who dad was, or did I have any birth siblings in that family? The ghost kingdom as a metaphor for Sedna trying to climb back into that boat. If we stay too long in this ghost kingdom, in this space of mourning, feeling victimized by our situation, it prohibits our growth. And trying to honor and love the part of us that transformed, regardless of the hardship. There's part of us that needs to be honored through what we went through as we sunk to the bottom of the sea and became incredibly powerful. That's the part that we need to turn our mind towards. Now, again, you can hear how this could be very difficult for a client to hear, especially an adoptee, telling them, oh, you need to stop worrying about who you were supposed to be. But sometimes that is literally the wisdom within this placement, is saying it's time to let go. We can't stay in this boat. That's a heavy one to start on. I'm going to do one more just so that we have multiple lenses here, as it's already 6:02. Maki Maki is another Trans-Neptunian object. I'm picking literally two. I was going to do more than that, but there's also 5,567, I think, the last time I checked, Trans-Neptunian objects. So we're obviously not going to cover them all today, nor do I even know all of them, but these are some big ones, especially coming up in Adoptee Consciousness. Maki Maki is systems consciousness. This is a way that we drive spirit into our life through playing with the areas that are kind of signified in our chart where Maki Maki is. And systems consciousness means like perspectives on systems. So he encourages us, Maki Maki, to see ourselves as our own organic whole, but also as a member of a team. So through participation and understanding what it is to be part of a team, what it is to be in the process of teamwork, or the teamwork process in general, we learn how to be sensitive enough to tune into our fellow team members, which is interesting to think about in terms of specifically in adoptee consciousness, activism. So interactions in the world giving us a worldview that is made up of our experiences and helps us to understand our place in the world. So we can look to him as like a higher octave of Uranus, because Uranus is really into understanding experiences and understanding systems and understanding society on a higher level. The thing with with Maki Maki too, though, is it can appear reckless, is what I've found, because it can appear undevoted, because the devotion with Maki Maki isn't actually to the system. It isn't actually to these groups of teamwork. It's instead, at its highest level, a devotion to spirit, not these earthbound connections. So there's this like trickster energy to Maki Maki that makes us possibly look kind of ungrounded or like we aren't taking things seriously, but it's actually aiding us in being able to go back and forth, in and out of engagement, in and out of different situations, so that we can compare and contrast our consciousness level in each of these situations. So as we understand the context behind ideas, that enables us to kind of be playful in the process. As we start to understand the context behind groups, we start to be more playful in the process. And at the spiritually evolved level, we can start to see the big picture and integrate our own personal focuses on deep levels into groups, into these creative processes. If you think, if you've read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, in book 1, Marcus Aurelius this is Stoicism. He's talking about all the people in his life and the things that he learned from them. And it's so interesting because he's framing, some of these people are not admirable people in society, but he's talking about the things he learned from them, such as he's learning from their mistakes. And it's interesting to think about that as almost like a book on systems consciousness, because he is taking from these experiences of being in relationship, being in systems, being in teams, and ultimately learning from each one of them, almost these like unspoken rules, these levels of consciousness that were available to him that perhaps even the people that he was learning it from weren't even at that high of level. So the reason I wanted to end on this one was because I see Maki Maki in the charts that I have of people who are leaders in adoptee community organization. And it's so interesting to me because thinking about systems consciousness and people who understand the system of adoption and have intimate familiarity with like the weaving and the ins and outs of adoptee consciousness, as well as adoptee autonomy, they tend to be the people who take this keen interest in trying to raise up the voices of other members of their team. The part about looking undevoted can be when these people, remember it's higher octave Uranus we're talking about here. Uranus can be seen as almost like this rebel or criminal energy because people don't understand it. So sometimes the community, if it isn't as high up in its understanding, if it's not at a high level of consciousness, the community can kind of not understand what that adoptee with this strong Maki Maki is doing or saying. For instance, people who are adoption abolitionists, they just, the word can make general society be like, well, what do you mean? Don't you want children who don't have families to have families? And adoptee abolitionists are kind of like, well, of course, we're not trying to say that people shouldn't have families. We are trying to bring our consciousness around a system to a higher level so that you can see that this isn't the ideal situation. There are ways for us to restructure, reorganize, rethink this that are very future focused, that look nothing like what we've done in the past, that look nothing like the systems that we have now. And it can be very hard for people to wrap their heads around that, especially if they're not at a higher state of consciousness already, and especially if they're in status quo, because those challenges to that mainstream narrative or those positive narratives around adoption, it can be very hard for someone to say, well, not only are you saying that this wasn't a good thing, but now you're saying you want to take it all away. So it can be seen as someone being reckless, that person saying, oh, I'm an abolitionist, or, oh, I'm challenging the system of adoption as it is. That can be completely misconstrued or misunderstood. But ultimately, that person is coming from a place that is so inspired by understanding the nuance of system and the nuance of what it is to do teamwork. And I don't just mean teamwork like, oh, we're playing capture the flag and we have to work together, but it's teamwork on this scale that almost like transcends time and space. We're talking about teamwork that brings everybody up in ways that aren't even just conscious, in ways that are going to raise the level of understanding and empathy for humanity that we haven't experienced ourselves yet. But remember that these objects have only been discovered in the past 20 to 30 years. So just like psychology in the 1930s was at a very rudimentary level, 30s, 40s, 50s, we'll say, was in a very rudimentary or elementary level, so is some of the work we have right now around these higher levels of consciousness, because now it is the time to step up to the plate and start engaging these higher levels of consciousness, engaging some of these practices and putting our old assumptions aside, lowering our inhibitions and moving out with confidence and that non-judgmental lens that is so important. All right. Well, with that was a very meaty episode. Thank you so much for being here. If you have any questions, just let me know, drop them in the chat. Like I said before, like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm going to update the resources to reflect the Adoptee Consciousness Model, as well as Martin's books and a few other little links. Thanks all, and I'll see you again soon.